Although it doesn't seem very popular to call for unity these days, at the end of the day, we're all dependent on the fact that it rains and a few inches of topsoil.
As a society, we argue over the 15% of things we don't agree on. Why can't we come together and focus on the 85% of the things we can agree on? And what we can agree on is we all want clean air, clean water, nutrient-dense foods, We want our communities to be revitalized and thriving. So I think that's where we need to put our focus, and it starts with each and every one of us.
Gabe Brown is my guest today, and he's going to help us think about how food can become common ground for common good.
76% greater profitability. My wife and I went through some tough times, and I know I was not a pleasant person to live with during those tough times. And thank goodness I married an angel, but those tough times are driven by the financial hardship. And once we started to realize, hey, we got to focus on our farm as an ecosystem as a whole, the money just seemed to come in.
All that and more on this episode 463 of the Working Cows podcast, brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios. And we are very excited to welcome back one of the founders of Understanding Ag, Gabe Brown. And we're going to talk to him today about how food is a uniting factor and that all of us have to eat and we all want good, nutrient-dense, plentiful food, and just about how we need to think differently about those things. And we're going to cover a lot of ground in this episode today, but Gabe has a unique opportunity, given his role at Understanding Ag, to travel and to see lots of different parts of the world and lots of different sectors and parts of the food chain. And so we're going to talk to him today about his perspective on where we're at and where we could be going if everything works out well. We'll get to that conversation right after a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. As farmers and ranchers, we've all heard pitches from ag consultants about the next great new product that will increase our yields, pounds, or animal performance. And each of those silver bullets comes with a price tag that you pay year after year, taking more money out of your pockets and putting it into someone else's. Our friends at Understanding Ag aren't out to sell you anything, but the knowledge to grow healthier soils, plants, animals, and profits. Their goal is to help you become your own best manager, a short-term client, but a long-term friend and partner on the road to regeneration. If you're still waiting for that next year that's going to be better, maybe it's time you give Understanding Ag a call. Check them out at understandingag.com. I know you'll be glad you did. Gabe, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows podcast. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks. Great to be with you again, Clay.
Yeah, I'm always interested to get your perspective, traveling, working with and educating ranchers, farmers, brands, communities, and governments in the regenerative agriculture space. What are some of the things that kind of stand out to you recently as far as the things that you've been noticing?
Yeah, so as I travel, Clay, it's becoming very apparent that we need to come together more as a society and find what I like to call common ground for common good. And I really think that agriculture, and more specifically regenerative agriculture, can be used as that conduit to find that common ground. Society today is facing many, many issues. And, if we start at the farm level, for instance, I don't have to tell any of our listeners about what grain prices are doing right now, what input costs are doing. We're seeing land prices continue to rise, and those are rising because of a number of reasons, but the main driver is government's influx of money into the farming community. And unfortunately, a lot of that doesn't end up in the hands, well, it does temporarily in the hands of farmers and ranchers, but it flows through to those landowners and to inflate, so to speak, these land prices. And the other thing I'm really seeing is, all the talk with the tariffs affecting exports. But if you really look at what's going on, it's not so much the tariffs that are affecting exports as the fact that there's just a glut of commodities on the market. You look at the amount of soybeans, for instance, being produced in South America, and you look at the amount of proteins that are being produced, whether it be Australia, New Zealand, South America. All those can come to influence the markets and the farm economy here in the U.S. And we're just seeing that compound to the point it's being very detrimental to rural economies and specifically to farming and ranching.
Well, and I think that with the cattle prices, I mean, they're just they're historic cattle prices that we've been seeing. And I've had separate conversations with multiple people in the last couple of days, even, where they're saying, we could sell all the cows and pay cash for the land and maybe buy some more land next to us, and what's that going to do to land prices in ranch country? We've got the subsidies affecting farm prices or land prices in farm country, and then now these high cattle prices are going to impact, I'm sure, land prices, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people that do take that option.
Well, but I'm one that if you can pay down debt, that's a good thing.
Right.
So the clients and people that we work with, there is a time and place to have borrowed money and to use that wisely to grow the operation, etc. But you can't have that debt hanging over you for long periods of time. And right now, interest rates have moved a bit higher. There was a small quarter point adjustment here. But if you have a chance to pay that down, what's wrong with that? Get out of it. Now, if you're going to take the cash and buy more land, that's okay. And certainly land is a good investment. But what I'm afraid of, Clay, is how many of these ranchers will do that, but then not get back in the cattle business. And I just hope, we've seen it, at least in my lifetime, I've seen it 3 times where there's been a massive amount of pasture land converted to cropland. And you wouldn't think that had happened, but with all these grain subsidies that come about, and the staggering dollar amount that people can get for cash rent for cropland, I'm afraid that may happen then.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, kind of in a different direction, some of those other entities that we mentioned there at the start, the brands out there, are you seeing some interest for regenerative products? Are we starting to see that develop in the space?
Well, certainly are seeing a tremendous amount of interest from brands, and there's a number of reasons for that. Number one, they want to meet their goals and concerns. And by that, I mean, we're seeing a increasing number of brands, companies, and even individual farmers that are really looking to do good for society, which is a good thing. Now, I know some of our listeners may laugh and say, well, brands are only out there for themselves and make money. I've come to the realization, yes, of course, it's true they want to make money, but there's a number of brands out there that really are looking at a more purpose-driven kind of mission. I don't know, Clay, if you've read the book The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek. Have you read that one?
I have not.
Okay. Well, everyone knows Simon Sinek, and Simon talks in The Infinite Game that how important it is to build a longer-term vision. And he more specifically talks about companies and brands. But I was thinking about that in the terms of farms, ranches, and how we need to have a longer term vision and keep our eye on that goal. Well, we're seeing this with brands developing that longer term vision. And many of them, as I said, want to do what's right. And they want to source from farms and ranches that are doing the right thing. Now, I want to make it perfectly clear. We all know that farmers and especially ranchers, I'll say that, I know I might get some pushback from farmers there, but we all know that landowners, managers want to care for the land. But you look at what's happened, primarily since World War II, we've seen this focus on yield, and that's come then at the expense of our resource and inevitably human health. Well, there's more and more brands out there that are saying, hey, this, has to stop. It can't just be about yield at the expense of everything else. And so they're focused on a long-term vision and maybe foregoing some of that short-term gain. And I look at that as a real opportunity for farmers and ranchers, to do what's right, not only for themselves and their family, but put together that long-term vision. And so how are you going to get the next generation in, and get them to come back to the farm? I often, when I'm talking to farmers and ranchers, I ask them, are you only going to farm and ranch this year? Or are you going to farm and ranch for multiple years? And for your children and grandchildren, what do you want to see them doing? And so with brands having an interest in sourcing from farmers and ranchers who are so-called, quote unquote, doing the right thing, that's a real opportunity for us as farmers and ranchers. And why not take advantage of it? And there are, I've seen a couple of different things happening. There are some premiums being paid for those products. Now, it's not for just large-scale commodities. You're not going to go just dump wheat at an elevator, grain terminal, for instance, and expect to collect a premium there. It has to be more of a direct sale, identity preserved, going to a certain brand. But that's bringing a premium. But even more so, there's a lot of brands out there that are starting to step up, and they're going to say, hey, we want to do the right thing. We want to source from farms and ranches that are doing the right thing. So let's help them move down this path. Let's help with the education. Let's help with the benchmarking and the baselining, some of the monitoring that we're requiring, so they don't have to take all the burden. And that's a good thing. If we can get brands to come in and help move us down this path, why not?
Yeah, they become a partner, in moving that ball forward, and that's a really powerful thing.
It sure is. Sure is.
Because I think, sometimes that can become an adversarial relationship, or you feel like a serf working for a lord, in some ways. And this is the opposite of that.
Yeah. Yeah. What I'm seeing so far from those brands, though, it's not onerous on the producer. They're not making these strict requirements and saying, hey, you have to sell it to us. Obviously they want the farmers or ranchers products, but in many cases, they're not making it mandatory. So that's a good thing.
Is there something that the farmer and the rancher needs to do to, make their product more compelling, as far as being able to share the story that goes along with it, somehow that makes it more compelling to these brands?
Sure. The brand wants a consistent supply of high quality product. So what does the farmer and rancher need to do to give them that? Well, they need to be moving down the regenerative path, so to speak. They need to focus on the 4 ecosystem processes, which I know in past podcasts we've talked about before, and how that will then drive profitability on their own farm or ranch in a positive direction. And it gives them the story, as you said, because, everybody wants to see that rancher standing out, nice cows and belly deep grass, right? And that story's worth something to them as marketing. But then also, and this is, whether we like it or not, there's brands that really do have these environmental concerns that they want to see the farmer address: clean air, clean water, carbon, cycling carbon back into the soil, which, we're certainly able to do in the ranching community if we properly manage things. And so that's the stories they want and what they're looking for. And why shouldn't we, as farmers and ranchers, not be able to take advantage of that? Why wouldn't we want to share our story? We're very proud of what we produce, at least we should be. Why wouldn't we want that?
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. Are rising input costs keeping you up at night? At Understanding Ag, they help producers like you save money and build resilience through regenerative agriculture. Their team of experienced farmers and ranchers will show you how to reduce reliance on costly fertilizers, pesticides, and feed by working with nature, not against it. With proven regenerative practices, you can improve soil health, boost water retention, and increase your land's productivity while cutting expenses. From grazing plans to cover cropping to full system redesigns, they tailor solutions to your land and your goals. Let them help you make the transition from input-intensive, conventional, to profit-enhancing regenerative agriculture. Visit understandingag.com and take the first step toward a more profitable and sustainable future. So, is the brand partnering on collecting some of that data in the end, or how does that work out?
Yes, the data is still owned by the farmers. Okay, the farmer doesn't have to worry, if I work with this brand, they're going to have rights to my data and my carbon or whatever it may be. No, they want the data overall aggregated, but they're not going to own that data. That's still up to the farmer, which is a good thing. But the beautiful thing about it is we're seeing other markets develop. I mean, I know you've talked with other guests on your podcast about carbon markets and different things. And, I kind of think the carbon market is one that there's some opportunities there, but you really need to be careful and what you're giving up if you're selling carbon off of your property, and you need to read the fine print, who's liable at the end if the carbon isn't there, etc. But there's a lot of other schemes that are starting up. There's a real interest in biodiversity, and I really think there's going to be some opportunities for those farmers and ranchers who have increased biodiversity significantly on their landscape. Their water, as we all know, is becoming a bigger and bigger player. And the ability to infiltrate water, then store it there via higher carbon content in the soil, that's going to be a bigger and bigger play. I just recently had a conversation with a gentleman. The Department of Defense is actually looking at it as national security, that we need to understand this water cycle and how much water is being held on the landscape. And then you also look, there's some real success stories out there for upstream interests, farmers, ranchers that are doing the right thing, being able to store more water on their land so it doesn't negatively affect downstream interests and downstream communities. And so there's some good things happening with communities actually partnering with farmers and ranchers upstream. I know of several examples where they're helping in education and the purchase of cover crops to hold both nutrients and water on the landscape upstream so it doesn't negatively affect the water quality and the quantity moving downstream at certain times of the year. So there's a lot of reasons for farmers to collect this data. And you got to have a baseline. You got to start somewhere. And why not? And it's a great story to tell. And from a farm and ranch standpoint, if you have that data and the gains you've made over time, that can really be used positively in marketing. And it was interesting as we were working with a bread company actually in the UK. And the number one thing they found that consumers were most interested in is what's it doing for pollinators on the landscape. If they put those statistics on how these regenerative farms are increasing pollinators, bread sales went up. So think of that. If a farmer has that data and can go to that bread company and say, hey, we have the proof here, what we've been able to do, that bread company is going to go, yep, I want to buy your grain. And that's a good thing. That increases profitability on the farm.
Yep. So what is is it a shift maybe is the first question. And then what's driving that shift towards the biodiversity being a metric that is one that they're paying attention to?
Yeah. And a lot of that comes from, how should I say this politely? I'll say those individuals and organizations who are focused on biodiversity worldwide. And, there was a study released, it was back at the beginning of COVID, how in Germany had lost 70% of its biodiversity in the previous 25 years. That's a staggering amount. And I tell people, like, when I travel, particularly in the UK, Ireland, and that the amount of insects, just how few insects there are compared to out here on the Great Plains, it's just amazing. I mean, just amazing to me. And when you talk to the farmers there, they'll mention that, well, we don't see as many fireflies as we used to. We don't see as many of this. And quite frankly, there's wide swaths of the U.S. that are like that also, unfortunately, and obviously, those pollinators, play a crucial role in our ecosystem. And I always go back to what Jonathan Lundgren taught me is in that for every insect species that's a pest, there's 1,700 that are either beneficial or indifferent. Well, so often in agriculture, we focus on killing that pest and we're killing all the beneficials, and we just can't continue down that path. It's not good for any ecosystem.
Yeah. This has been a great year at our house. First non-drought year we've had since we've been here in 6 years, really. And we lived off of 2019 and 2020, and then since then it's not been real good, and we were building a fence. We have a dam fenced off, but we were building the fence in there so they could get into that area and just put their front 2 feet in and take a drink out of the dam, and that was it. But for the past few years, everywhere I stepped, it was grasshoppers. Now, everywhere I step in that dam anyways, it was dragonflies. And that was one of my favorite things I've noticed about just the difference that it's made. And I think, it's partly the difference of doing the right thing in the drought years, but also just, you've got that habitat for them around that dam that's been fenced off for a few years now, and they're thriving. So
yeah, and that's a good thing. And those obviously those dragonflies are ferocious predators,
Right.
and a very important part of the ecosystem.
Yep.
And that's a good thing to see. Yeah, great.
So we've talked about soil testing in the past and the importance of that as, to develop that baseline and some of those things. How is the biodiversity measured? How would a farmer rancher measure biodiversity and start capturing that data as well?
Yeah, and when we talk biodiversity, of course, biodiversity of many things. I'm not a technology person, but in saying that, let's be honest, we're using technology right here to record this podcast. There's also technology. It amazes me how good some of the apps are becoming that you can put on your phone. So what my son and I do as we're walking around the ranch, we see a new plant species that we haven't noticed before. We'll just take a picture of it, and then when we have time, we'll swing it over to that app and identify it. And we've identified 174 different plant species now on the ranch. And people might say, oh, that's a lot. Well, I just look at what Lewis and Clark wrote in their journals about 300 plus species, and I'm going, boy, I got a long way to go, and
You're over halfway there, Gabe.
Yeah, it's encouraging to see, though. So we start monitoring that ourselves, and simply by using an app. And then it's amazing the technology out there. I was just visiting with a company from Europe that has these small recorders that farmers can put out, and it'll record the sound of birds. And then it'll identify, have the ability to identify which bird species it is. And I was thinking of that. We had Audubon Society came out to our ranch here this summer, and in half a day, they recorded 105 different bird species. And, I just wow, I knew there was a lot, but I didn't know there was that many. But you can use a recorder like that. There's some really amazing individuals out there that have the ability to identify bird species based off sound, and then you start recording it that way. Same thing with insects. Now, it was really interesting to me, this company that invented the recorder for birds. I didn't realize just how specific the diets were for many of these bird species, so they can extrapolate from the bird species what different classes of insects you have on your property, because many of those bird species prefer a certain diet, so they can assume if they hear so many of a certain species of bird, you're going to have a decent population of that insect. And then, of course, through some of the soil testing, PLFA, phospholipid fatty acid, we can determine the variability, the array, I should say, of microorganisms in the soil. And that is becoming a bigger and bigger player. And I know, Clay, you've had guests on your podcast talking about how the health and diversity of an ecosystem directly affects the array of phytonutrient compounds in the plant or protein that's being produced on that landscape. And I really think this is the next big uncharted territory, so to speak, an opportunity for farmers and ranchers because using a mass spectrometer, they can identify over 2,500 different phytonutrient compounds. And those phytonutrient compounds are what drives our gut microbiome. So the wider the array and the quantity of them, the healthier our gut microbiome is going to be. And then food can truly be used for preventative medicine. And we've talked about that before, just what an opportunity it is if we're able to sell food as preventative medicine. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very powerful. Appreciate that. Let's talk about the communities, kind of rural communities. What are you seeing there? How are they being impacted by just what's happening in agriculture?
Yeah, and unfortunately, as we know, there's been a pretty mass exodus of population from rural communities. Now we're starting to see a reverse in that trend, especially if those communities are focused on diversification. If we have a community that starts to realize just the importance of agriculture and agriculture from a means of diversity, not just, and I hate to pick on the corn bean guys, but not just a community that has a grain terminal that only handles corn and soybeans, but hey, what about one that handles wheat? Or how about diversity of livestock species? Is there an abattoir in that small town that'll handle multi-species? And we're seeing individuals gravitating to come back to and move to those type of communities because they want, a safer environment for their children, a good school system, etc. But obviously they need to have the population. So it comes down to the fact that we have to have profitability in agriculture, and we have to have it in a way where it flows through and a lot of that money stays in our rural communities. So often as farms and ranches get larger and larger, I don't want to say they're not supporting the rural communities, but a lot of that money doesn't stay in the rural communities. I know of many farm operations that now are 40, 60, 80,000 acres and up. Well, they're not buying their inputs from the local community. They're bypassing it and going direct to manufacturers and larger suppliers. And that's not good for rural communities. It reminds me of a direct quote out of Masanobu Fukuoka's book, One Straw Revolution. The fertility of the land is directly related to the number of footsteps on that land. And so the more people we can get involved, the healthier these rural communities are going to be. The more profitability we get back into agriculture, the more diversity we get into agriculture, the healthier our rural communities are going to be.
Yeah, shout out to Logan Pribino. I think he says the best fertilizer a farmer can add to his field is his shadow. So
and there you go. I like that one. Yeah, that's a good one. I had not heard that one.
Yeah, I think that. I mean, it's the same idea, right? And then I've got an elder at my church. The eye of the master fattens the lamb. If the more you're looking at things, the more you're noticing, and the better
and
healthier things
talk
are.
About that. Pardon me. I talk about that often. How we've kind of lost, unfortunately, in agriculture, that power of observation and that ability to adapt. And what we see is, as we learn to observe, we begin to realize the importance of diversity on that landscape, and that unfortunately, agriculture has become one of monocultures, and we're producing a single species crop. We're focused on just having the largest calves at the sale barn, etc., instead of the overall efficiency. Just yesterday, I spent quite a bit of time working on a model where large ranch wanted to integrate sheep into the operation. And so I was having a very frank discussion with them about how beneficial it'd be to, integrate not only sheep, but other forms of livestock onto that property and get more families involved in it. That it was being run pretty efficiently from just a couple of families, but the opportunities are just tremendous to bring more people in. And think of how that flows through. You're helping not only the ecosystem, but more families on the landscape, and then you're helping the rural community and the school system, and it goes back to that Simon Sinek's book and that long-term vision. And you have to have a reason to keep moving forward all the time instead of just looking at the most profit today. Let's look at the long-term vision and the consequences of what we're doing.
It's a biblical principle too, honestly, the principle of gleaning, where you would leave the corners of your field to be gleaned by the poorer people in the community, and it doesn't necessarily have to just be the poorer people in the community. That'd be great. But what about think about that, a 40,000 acre farm. They wouldn't even notice if they said, hey, you can come and run 1,000 chickens here.
Yep. Yeah. Clay, you bring up a great point. And I've often encouraged, my generation that, hey, you might not want livestock on your farm, but I guarantee you in your rural community, there's a young person just dying for a chance. And why not help them out? Why not let them run some livestock on a portion of your land? It'd certainly benefit your land. And think of what it'd do for that young person, Think of what it'd do for the community, Think of the food that could be grown off it and that young person could supply it to the community, starting their own business, I fully understand, the challenges of starting out in agriculture, financially, etc. But in saying that, I just gave a presentation to a group of college students, and I was telling them I couldn't be more excited for agriculture, the amount of opportunities, because we are seeing a real change, and it's being noted, a change in where people source their food from. And you're seeing more people wanting to get to know their farmer, buying local, and that's meaningful. And it's a real opportunity for those who want to do it. Now, I fully understand that established farmers and ranchers aren't going to go down that path. But hey, beginning farmers or ranchers certainly will. And that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. What are you seeing from the consumer side of this equation? You kind of just mentioned that too. What are some of the things that are standing out to you as far as the consumers?
Yeah, and this is really interesting. So, Regenify did had a survey done by a third party, and they surveyed consumers as far as what they think of regenerative agriculture and what the trends were. And it's amazing, Clay. It's over doubled each year the number of consumers that are looking to source regeneratively grown and raised products. There's a real hunger out there. The word regenerative right now is just on fire. I saw a sign here in our local community about regenerative eye care, and it's like, that's interesting. But the word regenerative is everywhere now. And yes, there's different meanings for it, etc. But I really think COVID played a part in this, because we started to see the shift shortly after COVID. People didn't want to go out. They started paying more attention to the food they were buying. They maybe started buying more at farmers markets, online, etc. And they're becoming much more well educated. Well, you tie that into what I talked about earlier with the research that's being done on phytonutrients, and that is it going to drive it even further, as consumer awareness increases. And then you look here in the U.S. about the work that Secretary Kennedy's doing, finally getting some of this junk out of our food system, that's even going to drive more awareness. And so there's a lot of factors coming together. And now look at just here the past several months, the major food brands that are pulling artificial dyes and the talk about, we have to cut back on ultra-processed food, and the brands that are willing to do that. And that goes back, Clay, to what I talked about earlier. These brands wanting to do the right thing for the greater good. Now, let's be honest, a lot of them are being quote unquote forced into it by what is what is being said in Washington. But there's a lot of brands that agree with that. It always frustrates me as I travel around the world. How can they be selling clean products in other places in the world? And in the U.S., we get all the junk with the artificial sweeteners and dyes and chemical additives. It shouldn't be like that. So this is a good thing. That trend of consumer education, consumer awareness, a trend towards better health, it all bodes very well for farmers and ranchers who want to be prepared for that and to go down the regenerative path.
Yeah. Do you see an increased awareness among consumers of, issues that are affecting farmers and ranchers and some of the things that they are dealing with on a day-to-day basis?
Yes, that's a great question. And yes, particularly from the mental health aspect, the agriculture, unfortunately, one of the highest suicide rates of any occupation, not only here in the U.S., but that's pretty much a worldwide trend. And obviously, Clay, as well as I, a lot of that is tied to the stress, the financial stress. And so that's why it's, another reason for farmers and ranchers to go down the regenerative path. Work by Dr. Jonathan Lundgren at the Ecdysis Foundation shows farmers and ranchers who use regenerative practices and really focus on it, 76% greater profitability. 76%, that's huge, And I tell you what, my wife and I went through some tough times, and I know I was not a pleasant person to live with during those tough times. And thank goodness I married an angel, but those tough times are driven by the financial hardship. And once we started to realize, hey, we got to focus on our farm as an ecosystem as a whole, the money just seemed to come in. And I'm not saying I'm, rolling in money, but you know what? Life's a lot better if you don't have that financial stress. And so we're seeing consumers interested in that. My son puts up a stand at the farmer's market every week, and it's really heartwarming to see members of the community come and to support some of these farmers that are growing their own food and starting down this path. And, they may have very small acreages, and that, they may only sell a few products, but consumers want to see that and support that. And that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. When they teach you about using the grazing chart in the Ranching for Profit school, the guy that's talking about it says, this is the chart that my wife calls the crappy husband chart because when the drought hits, I get more cranky.
Uh-huh. That's right. Yeah.
And then the other thing is, you told the story, I think maybe on a previous episode, that Paul was going to the sell eggs, and there was all these ladies coming to meet him, and he's married with kids now. So, I mean, he's not going to the farmer's market to meet ladies. It's just because it's still profitable. It's still a good use of his time.
It is. I'm very proud of what he's done and the business he's built. And I give all the credit for the direct marketing business to him. That was all on him because I told him after he got out of college, he had to add value to the farm. And so that was his way to expand the different livestock enterprises in direct market. And, I've got a son who's now 38 years old. That ages me, Clay, but, he's running a 6,000 acre ranch without debt. He operates on cash. And how many 38-year-olds can say that? Now, I'm not going to say it's always easy. We haven't had it as dry as you have down there, Clay, but we had the 3 driest years on record there, 2020 through 2022. And due to the resilience of the ecosystem, he didn't have to sell off any animals. He still ran the same number of animals. And, that's just key. So getting back to the mental health and the not only the mental health of the farmers, but the to make it conducive for the next generation. A farmer ranch needs to be profitable. I told the story before about how when Paul was going to high school, there was approximately 50 kids from farms and ranches in his graduating class. Well, today, to our knowledge, he's the only one that's actively farming and ranching. And, we don't want to force our children into any occupation they don't want. But in saying that, I put that on the parents. They didn't make it conducive, and it wasn't profitable. And I think that's what we're seeing in agriculture today. Yes, beef prices, sheep prices are really good, the proteins, pastured proteins. But let's be honest, grain prices are terrible. We were just looking at some statistics that showing that right now, several of the commodity grains are bringing the same prices they brought 50 years ago. Now, what have input costs done in the last 50 years,
Yeah.
And I often, and not to bring it back to our farm, but I often tell a story on how my wife and I got out of the debt that we had put ourselves in. Is we did things that others didn't want to do and found those ways, to really become a price maker instead of a price taker. And that's just, it's not for everyone. But I tell you what, it's a lot, easier on the mental health, and it allows the opportunity to bring the next generation in if you're profitable.
And I think
that's a good thing.
Those two things are very closely connected. The pressure of many generations before me, and now I'm the one that's facing losing this farm, or many generations before me, and now I'm the one that doesn't have a child that wants to come back to the farm or the ranch. 76% greater profitability goes a long way to creating space for Junior to come back to the ranch,
Yeah.
And it creates those opportunities, and it doesn't have to be, we've said this a lot, but it doesn't have to be a blood relative. You can create opportunity for a young person in your neighborhood, and that can be a powerful shot in the arm for the farmer rancher too.
Yeah, and we need to open our minds to ways to generate that profit. The really only way to generate new wealth is through photosynthesis, sunshine, plants. And this gets back to our earlier conversation on diversity. I can't believe how many people are willing to pay a rancher to come out and walk around their land and look at birds or maybe shoot a bird. Or boy, it's, Paul signed up for one of these. It's kind of like an Airbnb for hunters and bird watchers, where they can more or less have run of your property. Now, I put that, obviously you have control of where they go on it, but they'll pay per day. And Paul said, it's just like money coming out of the air, Now, obviously, you got to have some liability insurance and that. But the more biodiversity you have on your ranch, the more conducive it is for them to come out. Bird watchers, hunters, fishermen, over and
People
over.
looking for a place to take a senior picture.
Yeah, exactly. Paul's had that too. Nice cover crop field with some sunflowers in it. And boy, here they want to come and take pictures. Sure. Deposit your money here.
Yeah.
Well,
and I think Peter Bick is the one who points it out in his documentary that bird watching is like on par with some of the major sports leagues as far as the money that people spend on it every year, which is mind-boggling to me. I mean, I'd rather watch birds than the NFL too, but it just that blows me away that there's that much money in it.
Oh, it's just unbelievable. And then the other thing, man, you have a picturesque ranch, you put a little cabin on there and Airbnb it, and my goodness. So there's so many ways to add revenue streams, that's just a good thing. And I think it all comes around to what we started this podcast with, Clay, common ground for common good. No matter where a person or a business's interests lie, is it in clean air? Is it in clean water? Is it in, farm profitability? Is it in revitalizing rural communities? Is it in human health? Regenerative agriculture can play a significant role in all of those things. And we're starting to see that as a society. And it's globally. It's not just here. This year I've traveled from Australia to England and everywhere in between, and I'm seeing it everywhere, that there's this real interest in coming together and working together. And I think farmers and ranchers are going to be in the driver's seat for that.
Yeah, very good. Last sector that comes to my mind is government. And we've touched on that a little bit, but do you have other things to say about that, or the other things that you want to add?
Well, it just so happens that after we record this podcast, I have another Zoom meeting with a group that is doing just that, trying to influence public policy. And we're seeing more and more people getting involved with that. And yes, I know it doesn't matter what country I go to, political winds change all the time. But there seems to be an underlying tone here of that common ground for common good. And we talked earlier about, the ultra-processed food and dyes. And it's this underlying tone that, hey, how can anyone not admit that, yeah, that's a good thing to get some of that out of our food system? If you can't understand the wording on that label, you probably shouldn't be eating it, So, unfortunately, with a lot of our food, that's most of it. Just walk into a grocery store, and the more I just hate going into grocery stores, because the more you look at labels, the sicker you feel. You don't even have to consume it, and you start getting sick.
Yeah. It should only have 5 ingredients, and none of the ingredients should have 5 syllables.
Yeah, there you go. That's exactly right. And as I travel around, Clay, there are countries where, boy, the labels are clean. I mean, they're amazingly clean. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's nutrient-dense food.
Right.
But it has less crap in it, so that's a good thing.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, look at the people in those countries too. I think the health of a lot of those countries is reflected in the food that they're eating too. So it is always striking when you go to other countries and it's like, these people just seem to look a little bit healthier.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
for sure. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think, what do we do? How do we add our voice? What are some of the ways that we can, as individuals, help drive this change?
Yeah. And, so often I visit with people in there, well, I'm just one person, I can't make a difference. And I said, no, every person can make a difference. For one, you can make a difference in your own life. We choose the future we want for this world by what's on the end of our fork. We choose. So are you sourcing regeneratively grown and raised products? Are you getting to know your farmer? Are you supporting that farmer, that local rancher? And then what are we putting in our children's mouths, our families' mouths? Are we telling other people, hey, man, I just went and I bought some beef from the Connerys and it was really good, So I'd suggest you do the same. And then what are we doing in our local communities? Are we talking to the school board? Hey, how do we get more local foods in that school system? You start there, and it's like throwing a pebble into a pond. That ripple effect just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're seeing some major movements. I happen to know that USDA is going to make an announcement coming up shortly. That's going to, now with the shutdown, they've kind of postponed that announcement a little bit. But there's some announcements coming, not only here, but in other countries that are going to have some major impacts, at least I hope so, on our food system. And it all starts with that pebble in a pond.
Yeah. And I think one of the keys to that is do what you do and do it excellently. Proverbs 22:29 says, "Do you see a man who excels in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before unknown men." And Gabe, you've literally done that. You've literally stood before kings.
I have to admit this to you, Clay. So just last month, His Majesty invited me over to spend 2 days with him while he was on vacation. And so I stayed in his house, which very few people ever get asked to do. And then he drove me around Sandringham Estate. He drove me personally, and we stopped and looked at crops and looked at livestock, and it was a very humbling experience. And we laughed together. We broke bread together. I mean, it was really, really touching for me to do. But the king wrote a book that was back when he was Prince Charles in 2010 called Harmony, where he laid out his vision. And I talked about Simon Sinek's book and laying out a vision. And the king has a vision for the UK. Well, not only the UK, because he talked about it worldwide. And I think that's what we're talking about here, Clay, with common ground for common good. It's that vision we can all have. And I just really, I come back to what I've said before on other podcasts I've done with you. It seems today as a society, we argue over the 15% of things we don't agree on. Why can't we come together and focus on the 85% of the things we can agree on? And what we can agree on is we all want clean air, clean water, nutrient-dense foods, We want our communities to be revitalized and thriving. So I think that's where we need to put our focus, and it starts with each and every one of us.
Very good. Gabe, thanks for your time today.
It's always a pleasure being with you, Clay. Thank you.
Very good stuff there. Of course, as always with Gabe, really appreciate his perspective and just the breadth of his perspective. And what I'm really looking forward to in the near future, Lord willing, we'll be recording an episode with 3 different consultants at Understanding Ag that have been able to pass their farm operations, their ranches and farms on to the next generation successfully. And I just think there is a key there that's missing in a lot of this conversations. And I think that consultants that are successful at doing that are ones that we should listen to, and really, there's lots of them out there that do it, but it's always good to hear from more voices of people who have successfully made that management succession transition to the next generation. So looking forward to that conversation. That'll be in a month or so, but looking forward to that. Coming up next, though, on the Working Cows podcast, we'll be talking to Zach Osborne, and Zach is with Rockside Ranch in the Great Lakes area in Michigan, and we're going to talk to him about just how he got into being involved with Rockside Ranch, some of the day-to-day and what that looks like, some of the life transformation that's been happening on Rockside Ranch. But we're also going to talk to him about the soil health increases that they've noticed over the years with different practices that they have put into place. So really looking forward to sharing that conversation with you, coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.